Because as I told you earlier, we don't find these things. 99.9% of scientists who do what I do will go through their entire careers and never find an early hominin in the wild. And everyone, I think, was thinking, if a 9-year-old can do it in a minute and a half. We got back to the site early in the morning. 3 hours later, we had found nothing. Nothing you could call a hominin. It was like Matthew's block had fallen from the sky. We went in and out of this pit. We couldn't even put that block back into a tiny pit like that. And we were devastated. And in South Africa, I come from a British culture. And what we do in times of stress when all else is lost and you think you've failed is we break for tea. And so we did. And I walked back over as everyone sat to the left of this image, right about where Tau is, and I stood there looking in that hole, trying to visualize that moment 100 years ago, 110 years ago, when a blast must have gone off, rocks scatter out, miners go in, they start throwing, how did that rock get from there to way back there in that tall grass? And I began to have this sinking feeling that maybe this rock had come from one of those other caves and just fallen off a wagon, and we would never know its context, and context is king. And as I was visualizing that moment, trying to understand this, the sun rose, so it beat down just across the back of this wall. And there I saw, sticking out of the back of that wall, a proximal humerus of a hominid, sticking all the way out. We'd been in there dozens of times, all of us. Remember, I know what they look like. I did my PhD on them. I didn't say anything. I walked down into the hole. As I got closer, I realized that the scapula was in articulation. I did my PhD on those too, remember? I know what they look like. I still didn't say anything. I put my hand on the wall to get a closer look at this because I knew I'd found the child, and 2 hominin teeth fell out into my hand. They were hanging loose out of the rock. Then I said something. Everyone was very excited. Clambered down in here. First rock we turned over in the bottom had a proximal femur that was clearly part of that child's skeleton. Still had its growth centers unfused. We had found the position of the skeleton. It was an unforgettable, unbelievable moment. We had context. It never crossed my mind for a moment, although it should have, that was not Matthew's skeleton. That was another skeleton. We would only learn that a month later when I pulled that large rock out and we began preparing it, and we saw that its growth centers were fused. This was an adult. We would later find Matthew's skeleton lying 50 centimeters above it. This would turn into an adult female skeleton. Never before in the history of science had 2 skeletons been found in one place. And that began the extraordinary adventure at this remarkable site. It was very fortuitous to the timing that this had happened because we were able to apply technologies that simply didn't exist before. This looks like a beautiful video of that little hole in the ground. It is not a video. It is 21 million 3D GPS coordinates. You can begin to see them now as they appear, each with their precise position to within about 1.5 millimeters on planet Earth. That's a far sight better than my handheld GPS was. We can now contextualize these fossils that we recover from here within their position relative to each other. And in April of 2010, my team and I announced to the world that we had discovered a new species of early human ancestor. We would publish it in the journal Science, and my colleagues forced me to show this image because, you know, for scientists like us, being on the cover of Science is kind of like a rock star being on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine. So it's ego. But in that we described, at that time, the 2 most complete early hominin skeletons ever discovered. That's what they look like at that time. We named them a new species, Australopithecus sediba. Sediba means source or wellspring in the Sotho language. And over the intervening 3.5 or so years, we have recovered more and more of these fossils. Last year, we published more fossils of this extraordinarily well-preserved species. I hope you can see the quality of these fossils. They are preserved almost like none other that have ever been found. The quality of preservation allows us to look at every muscle marking. We have, some of you might have seen, announced just a few months ago, we found food particles attached to the teeth. There's organic preservation at this remarkable site. The fossils themselves are unusual, almost exactly what we never predicted. The brains are small, but very advanced. Just last year, we published additional papers in Science showing some of the truly beautiful fossils, truly critical and important fossils to our understanding. That's what they look like now, although it isn't what they look like now. Just a couple of months ago, my wife, who is a medical doctor, but finally decided to do her PhD in paleoanthropology so she'd have something to discuss at the dinner table, actually discovered, as part of doing an X-ray of blocks, on the last block she was looking at, the remainder of this skeleton. This is the child Matthew found. We would eventually call it Karabo. We held a national competition in South Africa amongst the children of South Africa to give it an appropriate name. A young woman named Mpumetse Kapile came up with the word Karabo, which means the answer. And she won a scholarship to university for that. An extraordinary, extraordinary work in progress. There is no reason to suspect that these fossils will not be complete. And they are, as I said, surprising. They look exactly like what they shouldn't look like based on everything else we'd found, fossils like Homo habilis from Olduvai Gorge and stuff. They date to 1.977 to 1.98 million years. That is a precise date. Plus or minus 1,502 million. They happen at a moment in time. They have arms as long as a chimpanzee. This is a chimpanzee on the left. That's sediba in the middle. That's a human pygmy on the right. So when we saw that, we knew exactly what their hands would look like. They would be long and curved, because that's a climbing arm. They would be long and curved like Lucy and her ilk had, where they were still adapted to trees. And when we found that hand, this is the most complete hand ever discovered in the history of science. It fit not exactly our preconceived idea. It was a human hand, stuck on the end of that long arm. With its long thumb and short, uncurved fingers, sediba had a perfect prehensile grip, something unique to us and Neanderthals. We've never even found a hand in Homo erectus, so we don't know. An extraordinary mosaic which went on through the body. Just to give you an idea, sometimes people go, oh, how do you know that's not just an ape? Well, here's a quick look of it, because we have all the bones of this body. This is the arm of sediba. This is the arm of an ape. And yes, you can see it's very long, but when you get to the critical functional areas like the hand, you can see that apes have long fingers and curve. You can see the differences in the upper limbs. This is a combination, like a transition between something primitive and something advanced. The pelvis, too, tells that story. In fact, every area of anatomy tells that story. In the middle is Lucy's pelvis. That's what sediba's pelvis should have looked like, but it doesn't. It looks like a tall, round human pelvis. There's the female, there's the male. And it shouldn't, because we thought, until this discovery, that the human pelvis, the unusual shape of the human pelvis, had evolved so that females could give birth to large-brained babies. It's called the obstetric hypothesis, and it's going to have to be written out of every textbook on anthropology in the world, because sediba doesn't have a big brain. That pelvis, that human shape, evolved for a different reason, and that's pretty cool. We were wrong. We know that the instant in time was really unusual. It occurred 30 to 50 meters below the surface. We can actually date the rock. It probably was a death trap situation like this, where bodies would fall into an underground chamber, probably in search of water. We find sediba there along with a host of other animals, all as complete as they are, saber-toothed cats, hyenas, antelopes, little mice, birds, insects, none of them have been scavenged. It is an extraordinary window into a tragic moment in time, and we in fact have found other hominin skeletons, and we haven't even excavated yet. At least 4 other individuals, including little babies, other adults, and other juveniles. We are sitting on a treasure trove of information. We are able, thus, because of the completeness of these fossils and this extraordinary preservation, to reconstruct. This is sediba in the middle. That's a reconstruction of Lucy. This is Turkana in an accuracy and way that has never been possible in any other find older than a few thousand years. It sits at a critical moment in time where prior to this discovery, you could have taken every fossil within 100,000 years of 2 million that was potentially critical to the answer of where our genus came from at that moment, and you could have put them in a shoebox and probably have room for a good pair of shoes around it. And now that's not true. We have hundreds and hundreds of elements and no sign of that stopping. With the potentials, like in that block my wife x-rayed, we can see the remainder of Carabo's skeleton. We will have almost a complete individual, certainly, and that's probably going to be true for everything we find. We've been able to do things like preserve information for future generations of scientists for the first time. We recognize that technology is changing the way not only we view the present and these fossils and study them, but recognizing how little we know right now. So we're leaving gifts for the future. You might have noticed the skull was still attached to rock. That's our present. That's our time capsule for scientists 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, 10,000 years from now. As they have new technologies and new methods that will date these, garner information. We are fast reaching a stage where we will not have to take these things from the rock, but can leave them. Because we can do this. There you see that rock, and there you see us make it invisible. There you see we can take that skull out and put it back together, every loose bit. We can then even look inside of that skull, and yes, that last image you're seeing is what you think it is. That's a brain. It's in there. It's in there in a funny way you don't think about. Because every time your heart beats, your brain pounds an image of itself on the inside of your skull. We now take this technology, scan the skull, peel out that interior morphology, and we can look at a brain. And that brain doesn't look like it should either. It's tiny, just larger than a chimpanzee, but it's begun to change. The anterior part is complex. There's asymmetry. It even has a large Broca's area, and Broca's area is oft associated with language. And that rewrites textbooks, because we thought it was brain gets big, then it becomes complex. Sediba is saying it becomes complex, and sometime later, brain gets big. We can look at the dental eruption so we can age him. You can see his third molar unerupted, cool stuff like that. And now I'm about to show you the most expensive picture you have ever seen in your life. I don't care what museum you've been to or what you've got hanging in your lounge. This picture cost 6.5 billion euros to create.